In theology, from time to time, there are drastic changes. A new view of man, world, and God begins to prevail in the theological community, where the whole and its idealistic appear in a different light. Hans Kung, The Paradigm Change in Theology. Welcome, friends, readers, listeners, and viewers from across America and around the world. Thank you for joining us this evening here, July 4th, the Independence Day of America, and happy birthday, America, and for all you patriots. And I just pray for our country and for peace and, continued well-being for and health, goodwill for everybody. I am honored to have as guest with me this evening both W. Kent Smith and also S. Douglas Woodward. Doug, are you there, brother?
I am. How you doing, Zen?
Oh, I'm honored to be here in fellowship with you guys, and I
that's great.
thank you again for your willingness to come on. Kent, are you there, brother?
I am, sir. Ready, willing, and able, Captain.
All right, excellent. Well, let me give you a chance first, Kent, to give out your website, contact information, and to talk a little bit about your book and your availability, where people can find your work.
Sure. My website is called LostStoriesChannel.com at www.loststorieschannel.com, of course. That's where you're going to find my books, particularly, and the one we're talking about lately is The Tales of Forever, The Unfolding Drama of God's Hidden Hand in History, which is focused on the 5,500-year prophecy given to Adam and Eve after they were exiled from the garden, and where it weaves in the apocryphal literature that's been essentially suppressed, as we've been discussing on the shows, by the sort of the tradition-bound church. Not that we're condemning them for leaving those books out, but we do think that it was part of a lost history, part of God's plan to have this literature there and sort of get lost. And so it's all about the 5.5 day prophecy, and I've looked at synthesizing these books and comparing them to the canonical scripture, and in an effort to recover this 5,500 day prophecy as opposed to the 4004 BC prophecy that we're typically have grown up in post-Reformation times, a la Bishop Ussher. So, and then also Amazon.com, of course, you can get it, the book as well, and then also on the Sacred Publishing, Sacred Word Publishing website, hosted by our friend and colleague Zen Garcia.
Yeah, certainly this 5,500-year prophecy has been something that has brought us all together in individual discovery, and it's a blessing to have each of you as confirming witness to what has become lost knowledge, and to be able to discuss and bring that to new light for consideration has been extremely exciting. Doug, if you would give out your website contact information, and also speak about a few of your latest books. You're a very prolific writer, so
I'm busy all the time. So yeah, my website is faithhappens.com, faith-happens.com. You can also find me by just typing in a search for Doomsday Doug. That'll take you to my website if that's easier to remember, and it might be. So, my books are available now on my website. If you're interested in the ebook, the Kindle version, or one of the others, you'll have to go to Amazon or to Apple for iBooks, or Amazon for Kindles. All of my books, except my most recent one, are out there. And let's see. So then, in terms of my books, I've written quite a few, but who's counting, right?
Right.
And so the most recent book is Rebooting the Bible, and that is the story of really uncovering the conspiracy that it's been known for 2,000 years almost, but it's not been publicized very much within the confines of the church. That there was a conspiracy on the part of the Jewish rabbis at the end of the first century after the temple to alter the Old Testament, to alter the Tanakh, so that the prophecies that speak of the Messiah would be obscured, so that it would not be so obvious that Jesus fulfilled them. So I lay that out. The other part of the book is to address the chronology, because this is what brought really the three of us together. Is one of the references that I stumbled across as I was looking at the Septuagint chronology compared to the traditional chronology that's in the King James and is made famous by Bishop James Ussher, which is it's a 4,000 year chronology, as Kent mentioned, between Adam and Christ. But the Septuagint talks in terms of a 5,500 year time period, roughly, between Adam and Christ. And so I came across that, and it became apparent to me that was one of the factors for why the rabbis changed the chronologies in the Hebrew in Genesis 5 and 11. And they did that to take a bunch of the time out, because they wanted to disqualify Jesus as being the Messiah. They wanted to suggest that he arrived on the scene 4,000 years from Adam rather than 5,500, which was what the prophecy that existed before Christ. That prophecy said that. So anyway, so I've written a lot of books. That's the most recent. I've written, most of my books are on Bible prophecy. The Next Great War in the Middle East is one that's still very current, talking about the Russia versus the United States, and laying out a scenario that I believe is still coming to pass, which is covered in that book. There's a book called Revising Reality, which is really dealing with cosmology, but it's dealing with things like angels and the Nephilim, and how does that all figure into a cosmos. And then a book I wrote with a fellow named Gary Huffman called The Revealing. And in The Revealing, we really deal with that verse, I think it's Romans 8:19. It talks about how the creation is waiting for us to be revealed. That as soon as we are revealed as the sons and daughters of God, that the whole creation will be made afresh, and the corruption that's inherent in the universe will be eliminated. And so the book The Revealing talks about what happens to us after the rapture and before the visible second coming of Christ. And so, different people have different views as to when the rapture occurs, but there's an interim period, and I think it happens to be more than a day between the rapture and the second coming. And so anyway, so that book covers some pretty interesting issues that are throughout the Bible, but again, not well discussed and talked about in the church very much. So that's my story.
Awesome. Lots to cover there. With regard to the interim period, how long do you think that period is? Is it a week, or because I've heard that mentioned also, that there's
right.
Right.
Yeah, there's of course the standard views would be the pre-trib view, the mid-trib view, the pre-wrath view, and then the sort of post-trib view. The view that I hold to, it would be considered a pre-trib view, but it's really a pre-trib view, because I believe my reading of the scripture would suggest that the actual period really of the final sort of the end days, or the day of the Lord, I believe it's probably a 10 or 10 and a half year period. And I believe, just to sort of lay the cards on the table, that the United States is attacked by Russia and other kingdoms of the north, which enables Gog and Magog to move against Israel. Yeah, and so the view I have this view, which happens to be, believe it or not, the view that Chuck Missler and Randall Price, Tim LaHaye, let's see, gosh, I'm thinking of virtually every one of the pre-trib guys, not everyone, but most of them, Grant Jeffries, another, that believe that there is an interim between the rapture and the actual 7-year countdown, the final week of the tribulation. And so I happen to believe it's probably a 3 or 3.5 year period. And so I weave that into a scenario that I talk about in the book, The Next Great War in the Middle East.
Interesting. One last question before we go into some of the other stuff that I want to talk about, but I wanted to ask you if you heard of the the conflict supposedly between the American and the Russian sub, and the cover up of that, the 14 dead.
I haven't
Noblemen.
heard. Yeah, I've heard about the incident. I haven't heard about the relationship, what relationship might have existed between America and the Russian sub, and so you'd have to probably fill me in on that because I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, I just did a show on it last night, and supposedly there's been an ongoing conflict in the Arctic where the countries are vying for the mineral resources, trying to claim as much of the shoreline
Mm-hmm.
as possible because of that UN convention that says, you can do that. And so they've been doing the studies and trying to establish and figure out the topography so that they could lay claim to these areas and to the resources there. But the conflict between nations in trying to grab and establish their boundaries up there has, forced supposedly a kind of Cold War scenario. And from what I understand of this particular conflict, that it went down on July 1st, and it was an incident between an American sub and also a Russian spy sub, and supposedly one was torpedoed, and 14 to 25 crew members of this secretive spy sub, this Russian sub, that they were attacked. If that's indeed the story, and then both Trump and Pence, and then also Putin and his intelligence people, some meetings were stopped and canceled, and emergency sessions were entered into, and yet this is now still being covered up. But of course, there's also the ongoing conflict now with between Israel and Iran, and them having reached a point of no returns, supposedly, and Israel is ready to, unleash fury on them and to stop their nuclear program at all costs. And so, so what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's. I'll jump in, and Kent, you may have a comment too.
Certainly.
I think there's there's been probably a number of actual direct combat instances between the U.S. and Russia. I think there was some pretty clear ones that were occurring in Ukraine. I had really sort of one kind of secondhand information, you could say, one person removed, of some Americans that were injured in fighting in the Ukraine, where they were engaged with the so-called Green Men at the time, which were Russian, probably Spetsnaz, they're special guys. They were coming in without any markings on their uniforms in the eastern part of Ukraine when that was really a hot situation. It still kind of is, but So I think that there are from time to time direct confrontations. I think that it's not in the interest of either country to broadcast those, because I think the world kind of holds its breath if it looks like that the U.S. and Russia are going to go into a direct conflict. And so I think that they both just, these things happen, and they elect not to talk about it. That's kind of my read on it.
Yeah, I think you're correct. And I think that, these kind of skirmishes are happening, but certainly they don't want to take it full blown yet. But we know that, from prophecies like Dmitry Dudelman and others, that they are, that there's a vision and the prophecy of a coming attack on America by Russian nuclear subs. I think that Syria also, that there's been engagement and overlapped in that particular country. And so
I think
certainly
there's probably some things happened during the Iraq confrontation as well, I think. So so these things they happen, there's just enough going on around the world in different places. There are a lot of hot zones in Africa that the public doesn't know about, where we're engaged actively militarily, and Congo and some other places. And so it's there's a lot we're not told.
Right. In Venezuela now and
Yeah.
Cuba and other places. Yeah.
Yep.
Kent, did you have a comment on, just kind of the stepping up of what seems to be harbinger for this uh, third war that's been spoken about, and
Sure.
that, it's been the protocols and all that also seems to talk about it, and that they're orchestrating these kind of things. But yeah, if you would.
Well, I would always mention the fact that again, like we've talked before, Doug's the historian, and Zen, you're an expert in these biblical stories and the apocryphal literature too. But my consideration is always, like I say, what does the apocryphal literature say about it, and how does it harmonize with our canonical Bible? How about a comment from Second Ezra that might sort of shed some light on this whole thing? Have you guys heard of Second Ezra?
Oh yeah, one of my
Oh
favorites.
yeah, it's one of the confusing things we might talk about is
Mhm.
whether Second Ezra is really Second Ezra or is it
Or
for Ezra?
third or fourth.
Right. Yeah.
Right,
But
right.
because we discussed that, I think, in our second show, the impact of Ezra almost being like a second Enoch, after the
Right.
Babylonian captivity, right, Zen? That
Uh-huh.
he was actually given a similar parallel job to restore wisdom. So
Right.
in the same way that Enoch did, and he actually ended up writing what we call the 70 books, of which we have discussed that's the prophecy of the 5.5 days comes from. So.
Uh-huh.
But in the context of what we're talking about here, being the World War III and the conflict between the East and the West, I've always been intrigued by Second Ezra 6:9, and it kind of speaks to this. And I don't know if anybody's even considered this because we're so conditioned to avoid these extra biblical books, right? So I just want to read this and see what everybody thinks of this. So in Second Ezra 6:9, it says. And I'm reading from the King James Version, by the way, which is kind of interesting off this website. And it says, "Then did I consider these things, and they all were made through me alone, and through none other. By me also they shall be ended, and by none other. Then answered I and said, What shall be the parting asunder of the times? And when shall the end of the first and the beginning of it that follows? And he said unto me, From Abraham unto Isaac, when Jacob and Esau were born." When then Jacob's hand held first the heel of Esau, for Esau is the end of the world, and Jacob is the beginning of the one that follows.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah.
That's World War III in a nutshell.
Uh-huh.
The twin sons of Isaac, who basically Paul speaks of in the book of Romans, saying, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. And a lot of people forget they were twins. So they were, I mean, think about the drama of this in God's word, that the twin sons of Isaac were literally the same person, right? Same face. A lot of people don't think of that. And yet, in a sense, like I say, these are microcosms. These are, as we always talk about sort of the allegorical nature, right, Doug, of the Bible.
Sure.
There is truth, and it's almost like poetry in God's word that is more than poetry. So Esau is essentially a metaphor for the side that's against the house of Israel, or the Israel and all its many incarnations throughout the Western nations, that I would see. So you can see there is going to be this conflagration, and but what's the loci, right? Where's the center point of this conflict we're always trying to find? And in just one simple sentence, Esau is the end of the world and Jacob is the beginning of the one that follows. There's just a lot of truth that can be mined from that
Sure.
poetry.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yep. I think one of the things that we tend to forget is that Esau and Edom are really synonyms. That Esau was the person, but Edom was the nation and the people, and of course Mount Seir, Petra, and all those things are associated with Edom. And there's Zen, you would know about this. Which I don't know much about, but I think there's been a lot of discussion about whether Edom, in fact, was the Romans. Did they migrate and
Right.
become the Romans? Because
Yes.
there's
I do
yeah.
believe so. Yes.
Yeah, and so there's certainly there. I think metaphorically, in fact, chatting with I have a Jewish rabbi that's a friend, and chatting with him, it's, the Romans and the Edomites are both really viewed as those that oppose, the plan of God, that oppose Yahweh.
Right. It's also connected to, the division of Ishmael and Isaac. That
Mhm.
they represent the same conflict and the same kind of division of the sides. And we see also spoken about, as far as Albert Pike's vision of the political Zionists and the radical Islamists and the Christian world all being brought into conflagration, and then the atheistic communists coming out of that power vacuum to
Mhm.
kind of seize control, and then the Antichrist is brought forth, and the into the public the whole worship, as far as Luciferianism and the worship of the Antichrist. So,
Yeah,
which follows
it's
along with Daniel's vision and all.
one of my the subjects that we can talk about sometime is the Islamic Antichrist versus the, you might
Yes,
say, the
Mahdi.
Luciferian Antichrist. I
Uh,
keep a good relationship with Joel Richardson, but I don't. Joel and I disagree on this, but we keep a good line of communication open on that subject.
right on. Yeah, definitely. There's lots to be said. I mean, we could talk about Ezekiel and also Jeremiah 50 and 51,
Hmm.
uh, the nation of unwalled villages, the hammer of the world, those kind of things, which I believe are connected to America
Hmm.
in prophecy. And a lot of people believe that we're excluded, but I think that Mystery Babylon has connection to us to some degree. So,
You bet.
uh,
Yeah, I do
yeah.
too. I've, as you know, I've written several books on that topic. The Final
Uh,
Babylon being probably the bestseller of those. And so yeah, I violently agree with you.
yeah, yeah, and definitely we see all of that coming about. And we'll move on from here, but
Mhm.
now there's the treaty between Turkey, Iran, and Russia,
Right.
and that's not. I don't know of any other time that that's really been in play, and yet
Right.
we see the fulfillment of that coming about now.
Yeah, it actually has not been in play. Because they've all been rivals
Right.
essentially.
Yeah.
So
That's what I thought.
yeah,
Yes.
so their unification is, or at least working together, their alliance is a meaningful thing.
Right. Definitely. I fully agree. Kent, let me give you a chance for comment, and then we'll move into the apocryphal text. And
Well, I was just listening to you guys. Like I say, sometimes I'm not that politically savvy, and so I would defer to your guys' wisdom on that. So I like to say I'm kind of my theory is always from when it comes to politics, let politics work themselves out and I just kind of focus on faith, and faith cometh by hearing, and I admit that sometimes it's like having a really strong right arm and then you have a weak left arm just because you're so busy making the right arm strong. So
I
my
used
whole time spent is studying these scriptures.
Yeah, I used to work for a pastor many years ago, and he used to say sometimes when he was in the pulpit, he said, "My daddy, who was a preacher, taught me that there are two things you don't talk about in the pulpit, and one of those is politics, and the other
right.
one is religion."
Right. But I can say now that I've said that I can argue with myself and say, but I do believe that again, when you look at the scriptures like this, Esau being the end of the world, I would look through these kinds of scriptures as a prism to studying politics. So as I'm hearing politics and all these machinations of, like you say, Turkey and the Islamic nations. Again, I love Islamic people. I love all people. I'm not a hate mongerer by any sense of the imagination, or because that's what America's all about. America is a place where we all can come together. But I am a little suspicious that, yeah, there is definitely a war brewing. And if the Bible says that Esau is the end of the world, to me, that would say, look at these alliances and look at the animosity that they would have toward the sons of Jacob, which could be construed as being the Western nations, who are sort of fulfilling the gospel mission to get the word of Christ out, and the fact that a lot of these other nations really hate the Christ. They're burning images of Jesus and things like this. I don't spend a lot of time, in studying politics, but I do look at it. What I would say, I think it's important for us to again accept the prism of God's word and to sort of ferret out what the heck is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, as far as to study or the examination of politics, I try to avoid that as much as possible. I think that the whole left-right is a false paradigm, but my interest is prophecy. So we'll be right back, everyone.
You are now tuned into the truth frequency.
Your protection from deception. TLR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
And in those days, there were giants in the land, and the sons of the angels of God looked upon the daughters of men and found them fair, and took of them wives, and their sons became of old great men of renown. So they have been mixing with us on a genetic level since the time of Enoch and Ezekiel's will.
Here on Earth we're intrigued by the sun, moon, and stars, and imagine there's got to be planets like ours. Some conceive of a face on the surface of Mars, so in need of a meaning and purpose we've lost. That indeed they believe that these might be our gods, or that maybe with time we'll do right and evolve and eventually reach what they seek and then solve all the problems of man. But they really don't know that they fall in the works of our hands are but just filthy rags. So we travel the lands to dig up our past time lapses, and with it are much of the facts. Some imagine that gods came in alien crafts. They react in this way, they're so
All right, welcome back, everybody, for a second segment. We're going to move into the study of the apocryphal, pseudepigraphal, and extra biblical materials, and why we believe that I at least believe that before somebody condemns and criticizes and judges a text, that they should at least read it. And, and after having done so, then allow discernment to decide whether, there's anything of interest. And certainly I don't believe at all that, all the extra biblical material is inspired in any manner, but certainly I do believe that there are lots to consider, and that in studying a lot of this material, that we can gain clarity on the foundation of what is the canonical materials, and things that may be ambiguous within them. And so I'm going to turn this over first to Doug, and he's going to make mention of, and also we can link, Doug, I'll post in the chat room the link to your article, and if you would tell people where they can go to find it, read it, and study for yourselves, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, I tried to write, it's a lengthy article, but I tried to cover, all the key issues in it. And if folks listening tonight, if you want to go to my website, you can kind of be looking at the article. You go to faith-happens.com, and on the front page, go down one or two of the entries, and you'll see books banned from the Bible. What is missing from our Bible today, and why? Books banned from the Bible. And so what we had talked about before that I would do here as a way of kind of serving up the program and kind of putting things on the table for us to talk about is just provide some kind of a framework for what we're talking about when we say apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. I think I can finally now pronounce pseudepigrapha. For a long time I had a hard time trying to figure out what the right emphasis was and what syllable. But anyway, there's essentially I think everyone has heard the term canon, and we're anyone that has read the Bible with any deliberate intent, certainly understands that there are in the Christian Bible 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. In the Jewish version of the Old Testament, I could say it that way. Sounds kind of funny to say that. The 39 books are compressed into a 24, I believe it is, and because a lot of the books, like First and Second Chronicles and First and Second Kings and Nehemiah and Ezra and so forth, are all kind of collapsed into the same book. But anyway, essentially the Old Testament that is known as the Biblia Hebraica, which is the Jewish Bible, was adopted by essentially all Christians, with the exceptions of the Greek Orthodox Church and the other Orthodox churches. So the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church both adopted the Hebrew Bible as our Old Testament, and there are some problems which we'll get into and talk a bit about. But the Septuagint is the oldest of the Bibles, and it actually dates to about 282 BC, and it was a translation of the Hebrew, the oldest Hebrew, that's is different. Let's put it that way. The oldest Hebrew, original Hebrew Bible that Ezra would have worked on around 440, 450 BC. It is not the same Hebrew Old Testament in all details as the Hebrew Bible that was, we'll say, sort of remanufactured around the end of the first century AD, or about 550 years after Ezra. But in 285, really only about 150 years after Ezra, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in Alexandria, Egypt, and in that process, the other writings, in addition to the Hebrew books, that were pretty much all in place by that point in time. There were other writings that were included, though, in that grouping of books, and the translation originally was just the first 5 books, the so-called books of Moses, and those books were the first ones. It's possible that Joshua and Judges were translated very early on as well, but really over the next 100 years, the rest of the Hebrew Bible would be translated into Greek, and a few of the books in the Septuagint, such as First and Second Maccabees, and I think the Wisdom of Sirach and some others, may have been written in Greek to begin with. So, but anyway, these were all bundled together, and this was the original Bible that the Jews used going into the time of Christ. So as we begin the first century, begin the time of Christ, the Old Testament includes the writings that we call the Apocrypha today. All right, and then as as I document and others have documented, when we look at the quotations from the Old Testament that are in the New Testament, you're going to see those quotations reflect the Septuagint. And I have done pretty extensive study. There's about 315 passages from the Old Testament that are directly or indirectly referenced in the New Testament, and those many of them reflect some unique wording in the Septuagint that is not well reflected in what is known as the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew Biblia Hebraica that that's kind of come down after that time. Really began, we can think, as I said earlier, 100 AD, Rabbi Akiba, who was really the father of rabbinical Judaism, and before they were rabbinical Judaism, they were this group called the Pharisees. So anyway, so the Bible changed. It was changed to obscure the fact that Jesus of Nazareth certainly appeared to fulfill the messianic prophecies, and both in mission as well as his nature, his being, and so forth. So at that time, the Jews, the Jewish rabbis, and I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm a very strong advocate for Israel, but the Jewish rabbis decided to, in effect, reshape the Bible. They eliminated all of the writings except for what we know as the canonical books. So they rejected everything in the so-called Apocrypha. All right. So the Septuagint continues on with the Apocrypha and really becomes the Christian Bible. But the Jewish Bible is shortened, it's compressed, and so all of the Apocrypha disappears. Now, with that said, let me now there's sort of a couple of branches we have to talk about. The Septuagint continues on, and it is the basis for a number of copies that are the Syriac Bible and some other Bibles, the Coptic Bible. They are copied from the Septuagint, from the Greek, into other languages. The one Bible that was translated from the Hebrew is the Peshitta, and so I'm sure, Zen, you're probably all over this stuff. You're probably thoroughly familiar with all this.
Yes.
But around 400 AD, a fellow named Jerome actually created what is today known as the Latin Vulgate. There had been a number of Latin Bibles that had been created also from the Septuagint that were known as the Old Latin, but there was concern that these Bibles, there were various versions, and they wanted to centralize, and they wanted to get everybody on the same page, literally. And so they created a new Latin Bible. And Jerome made the decision, based upon influence by a number of his friends, to use the Hebrew. And he translated into Latin from Hebrew the scriptures. And from that point in time, the Western Church, which is really the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox, they began to split. And this was what St. Augustine was worried about around 400 AD. He and Jerome had a lot of, you might say, sort of verbal fisticuffs over whether it was wise for Jerome to use the Hebrew Bible rather than the Greek Bible. All right, so now I won't go too much farther in that, because the real subject we're going to deal with is the Apocrypha and then the Pseudepigrapha. But the Septuagint includes all of the Apocrypha. The Latin Bible, Jerome reluctantly included, I would say, the Apocrypha into the Bible, and it continued to be a part of the Catholic Bible. Now, today, Protestants in the 20th and 21st century always assumed that the Protestant Bible didn't have the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was in that Catholic Bible, and we don't like the Catholics, and we don't like the Catholic Bible. So, the Apocrypha's got to be very evil. And so that mentality still sort of lingers on. But the reality is that the Apocrypha was even in the King James Bible in 1611, and continued on really until into the 19th century, when, not for theological reasons, but for printing cost reasons and for convenience reasons, the Apocrypha was taken out of the Protestant Bible. All right, and so what we found was that people wanted to carry a Bible, but they didn't want all those extra pages to weigh them down, and the printers could print them cheaper. And so all of the Protestants decided they could do without the Apocrypha, thank you very much. And so they basically turned away from it. And then it became, like I said, it tended then to become a point of differentiation between Catholics and Protestants, and the Apocrypha began to get kind of a very jaundiced sort of reputation amongst the Protestants. So that really deals with the Apocrypha. And we haven't talked about the Pseudepigrapha, but I'll take a breath and see if you guys want to make any comments about that.
Yeah, no, I think what you have brought up is very important, and with regard to especially that it was a printer's decision, with being too bulky and to be more cheap and more efficient, that, these texts were removed, and not for theological reasons or for, other theological considerations. And so that's very interesting. And when people learn that, they kind of push it off as, well, that can't be the reason, because, how can they justify condemning it when, it's based on something like that?
Yeah. And we'll probably talk a little bit about the King James only folks, but the King James only folks are very, very quick to condemn the Apocrypha, not really always recognizing that it did exist in the 1611, which was the first King James, which they very much revere as an inerrant Bible. And so their inerrant Bible also included the Apocrypha, which even the early church fathers did not believe. Like, even Origen and Augustine, they didn't believe the Apocrypha was inspired at the same level. But they all believed, and this is, of course, the point I'm making in my article, they all believed that the history of the church is that it is in the Bible. And so what right do we have to tell the apostles and the church fathers that we don't trust their decision to leave the Apocrypha in the Bible? We're going to take it out because, golly gee, it costs too much and it makes our Bibles too heavy.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So okay. So that's the story of the Apocrypha. And then the next group is
hold on real quick.
Yeah.
Kent,
Go ahead.
Kent,
Yeah, Kent,
did you want to make a comment here, or
well,
any question? Or
naturally, always. It's hard. I mean, it's just, but it's tough being with another group where it's hard to get a word in edgewise, because that's usually me. I'm the guy that usually can't get a word edgewise in, right, Doug?
Absolutely. You are a chatter.
Yes. So this would be my contribution. And again, naturally, it would always revolve around this 5,500 year chronology that and the idea that okay. So what makes that 5,500 years so important, in my view, which would have inspired folks in the first century, that like the what was his name, Rabbi Akiva?
Rabbi Akiva.
Akiva, yes. So my curiosity, being the mystery hunter that I am, I'm always thinking, well, what was so important? Why was it so important to change the chronology from 5,500 to 4,000 BC? Is there some reason, some logic? Was it just a legend? Was it just like, oh yeah, let's just change it from 5,000 and just eeny, meeny, miny, mo? Because what did we learn? What brought us together, Zen, was the 5,500 year prophecy that was actually pre-Christ, that there really was it wasn't just the idea that Christ would come on the sixth day, just because Adam was made on the sixth day, but there was a very specific prophecy that was found in the Nicodemus gospel, right? That was also very popular in the pre-Reformation days, and in fact, so much so that Dante actually was inspired by it when he talked about his Inferno and the so-called the census, and this was hugely popular prior to the Reformation. So, but it spoke of the 5.5 days, and that was the first time I had ever heard of your teaching through my friend Jeff Mazzara, when he said, "Hey, listen to this Zen guy," after he read my book. And you were reading from the Gospel of Nicodemus. You read about the fact that the Annas and Caiaphas, who had condemned Christ in the trial of Jesus, they actually had mentioned that this 5.5 day prophecy had been acquired and been read about in the book of the 70. And so it was that was my idea, was okay, so there was a specific reason why they had to change the chronology from 5,000. It wasn't just a random figure that they were trying to erase. That was actually a specific figure. And of course, this all went back to the book of Adam and Eve, which again falls in that camp of apocryphal literature. So when I found out about Doug's book,
let me jump in and clarify a couple things for the audience. Okay, we have to be in our discussion today. We have to be clear to distinguish between the Apocrypha, which are very specific books that are identified within the Septuagint, the Vulgate, and the Old Protestant Bible, we'll call it, and pseudepigrapha. And the books that you're talking about, you mentioned Second Esdras, which is really in the Septuagint's language. It's really for Esdras, and you mentioned Adam and Eve, and you've mentioned the Gospel of Nicodemus, and all those. Mm-hmm. Those all fall in pseudepigrapha. And pseudepigrapha is not in the Apocrypha, but it is called apocryphal. It's sort of identified by an adjective of being apocryphal. But we need to distinguish that, and because we want to talk about, I think what we want to get to is we want to be able to differentiate or delineate between There's certain pseudepigrapha that has gotten popular today, and then there's certain pseudepigrapha which you and Zen know a lot about, and the rest of us don't know much about. And that is, what you're talking about, the Gospel Nicodemus, Adam and Eve literature, and so forth. The books that are pseudepigrapha that sort of everybody knows about, that's probably listening to this broadcast, will be books like the Book of Jasher, First Enoch, maybe Jubilees, and a few others. All right. So,
Right.
but you're talking, just to clarify, Kent, and then I'll shut up once you finish. You're talking about a number of books that are pseudepigraphal books that were, supposedly written by Nicodemus or whoever, but they likely were written not by those individuals, but by other individuals, hence why they're called pseudepigrapha, meaning that it's sort of falsely autographed by somebody else. Okay, I'll
Right.
stop. All right.
Right. And again, the reason I bring it in, because in our discussion about the apocryphal literature and about the conspiracy in those early centuries, my ultimate desire is to get people back on track to, okay, so Doug, you're writing about the conspiracy, but my question is, again, it's like the detective. What was their motive, right? You know what I mean? Was it just the idea? I mean, so we change it from 5,500 to 4,000. You see what I'm saying? So what?
Totally.
So,
I totally see what you're saying.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
Absolutely. There had to be a motivation, and that's why I got interested in the 5,500-year prophecy,
right?
Because it looked like it was the motivation.
Because now you have a motive, so to speak. So if I was Columbo or some detective, right, some CSI detective saying, okay, so there was a change in the chronology. So what? But if you say to me, okay, now he's changing God's faithfulness. Now there's a foci of when God said to Adam and Eve that I'm going to rescue, I'm going to come, one will come and incarnate into flesh form, as Zen describes it. Now you have God's faithfulness is on the line. So if you can disrupt that continuity from Adam to Christ, then you can say, you know what, God's not faithful. Now he's a loser. Now he's not the God of all power. He's not the God of all history. But if you change it from 5,500, so in other words, it's not enough to say they changed it. You have to say why and wherefore and where were those clues. Now that leads us to the question of how do you legitimatize these apocryphal books, because we weren't there. We don't know who wrote them. We can't go back in time. So we have to say, well, how do you legitimatize them other than say the chronology and the pyramid, which is another one of my favorite subjects? But
Well, let me pose the question. There clearly are some books that were written after Jesus was crucified, resurrected, and so forth. There are books that were more in the early church period of time, and that might have been, like the Gospel of Nicodemus. Obviously, Nicodemus was, contemporary with Jesus. So, and Annas and Caiaphas were, of course, as well. They were instrumental in his death. But the question for me, and this is the question I have not had answered yet, although I think I'm getting closer to it, is what books existed prior to Jesus that had the 5,500-year prophecy in them? Was it the Adam and Eve literature? Was it some other literature? And that's the thing, because until I know that literature existed before the time of Christ, and that it was really popular amongst the rabbis and amongst the people, the teachers, that they all expected that Christ was going to come 5,500 years after Adam. Once I know that they all believe that, then I go, yes, okay, now we know there really was a motive. But if we don't have any evidence that those documents, those books existed before Christ, it's harder for us. I mean, we can speculate that there were books that existed, but we can't really prove it as well as we could prove it if there were books. We know that they were written, kind of like the books in the Apocrypha that were written before the time of Christ. Most all of them. They specifically don't talk about this, but the other books you're talking about, Kent, do my question, and this is kind of one of the things we wanted to get into more along, kind of a little bit of a debate or discussion, is which books originated this idea of the 5,500-year prophecy?
Right, and that's where I want to
that's a
throw in.
great
I'm sorry,
question.
we're coming up on the top of the hour, so I knew I was
Right.
going to run out of time. But again, this is where I come in with my kind of, again, deductive or inductive. I'm never quite sure which one it is, but my brain is saying in the same way. So you can't determine which books there were written. Maybe Adam and Eve. We assume their first and second book, Adam and Eve. Who we don't know who wrote them. We don't know that, but we do know, again, there was a supreme motivation for these people to change the chronology for some reason. And if there wasn't literature saying there was a 5,500-year prophecy, then there would have been no motivation. So if there was no motivation, there would have been no, in our view, sort of in this scenario, a crime, right? No motivation.
Yeah, whatever motivation existed, we don't know what it was.
We don't know what it was, but it was strong enough for them to have to change the word of God, to change their beloved old. Like you say, this is what was so astounding. The Jews were very strenuous. They were to the jotting of the I and the dotting of the T. They would not change a syllable, and yet they were willing to change an entire chronology. For what reason?
Now, one other point I'll make before the break is that if we look at some of the church fathers, and I think you've got the quotes probably, Kent, at your fingertips, some of the church fathers in the 1st or 2nd century after Christ, they reference the 5,500-year prophecy. And there is evidence within a very short time after Christ that there was this 5,500-year prophecy, and they allude to it as if it was the motive, but we don't know exactly which books it might have been that existed, or where this idea came from, if you will.
Which leads us to the Cave of Treasures.
Perhaps.
And to other primary Adamic literature, like especially with the book of Atum and Ua, which is part of the Thracian Chronicles, and I feel that the study of that affirms what we are talking about. That, like the book of Enoch and the prophecies of the coming of the elect one, the Son of Man, that it prophetically alludes to the coming of Christ and to specific detail of his coming as well, and not only his first incarnation, but his second, which I'll share something when we come back from break, which to give example of what we were talking about. Doug, did you want to finish a comment?
Oh no, I'm good. I think that's a good stopping point, and we come back. We can dig into that, because that's really the evidence. We've established evidence after Christ. Let's see if we can find some evidence beforehand. That would be key.
All right, we'll be right back for second hour.
Censorship and regulation is becoming an ever.
This is Truth Frequency Radio.
The wicked ones obviously under heavy Masonic influence. God said to Adam, I have ordained on this earth days and years, and you and your descendants shall live and walk in them, until the days and years are fulfilled, when I shall send the word that created you, and against which you have transgressed, the word that made you come out of the garden and that raised you when you were fallen. Yes, the word that will again save you when the 5.5 days are fulfilled. But when Adam heard these words from God and of the greater 5.5 days, he did not understand the meaning of them. That's to give you an idea of the prophecy, but I want to share something else just to show you how detailed the knowledge of the coming of Christ was known to Adam and passed down to his descendants. It says of this prophecy, Adam said to Seth, his son, "You have heard, my son, that God is going to come into the world after a long time. He will be conceived of a virgin and put on a body, be born like a human being and grow up as a child. He will perform signs and wonders on the earth, will walk on the waves of the sea. He will rebuke the winds and they will be silenced. He will motion to the waves and they will stand still. He will open the eyes of the blind and cleanse the lepers. He will cause the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. He will straighten the hunchback, strengthen the paralyzed, find the lost, drive out evil spirits, and cast out demons." He spoke to me about this in paradise after I picked some of the fruit in which death was hiding. Adam, Adam, do not fear. You wanted to be a god. I will make you a god, not right now, but after a space of many years. I am consigning you to death, and the maggot and the worm will eat your body. And I answered and said to him, "Why, my Lord?" And he said to me, "Because you listened to the words of the serpent. You and your posterity will be food for the serpent. But after a short time there will be mercy on you, because you were created in my image. And I will not leave you to waste away in Sheol. For your sake I will be born of the Virgin Mary. For your sake I will taste death and enter the house of the dead. For your sake I will make a new heaven, and I will be established over your posterity. And after 3 days, while I am in the tomb, I will raise up the body I received from you, and I will set at the right hand of my divinity, and I will make you a god just like you wanted. And I will receive favor from God, and I will restore to you and to your posterity that which is the justice of heaven. You have heard, my son Seth, that a flood is coming and will wash the whole earth because of the daughters of Cain, your brother who killed your brother Abel out of passion for your sister Labuda, since sins had been created through your mother Eve. And after the flood, there will be 6,000 years left to form of the world, and then its end will come. I'll stop there. That's from the Testament of Adam. And so you see, again, from the primary Adamic literature, that all throughout is great detail and knowledge of the coming of Christ, and that it was the word of the Lord who instructed and told Adam of the prophecy of the 5,500 years and how he would incarnate into flesh form, be born of a virgin, and crucified, descend down into Sheol to restore them to their former estate and their original bright nature. Let's go to Doug first, and then we'll go to Kent.
Okay. Well, I think, Zen, the question I have would be, where were you reading from, and do we know that that literature was, in fact, prior to Christ? Because obviously, as soon as you mentioned the Virgin Mary and some other things, my skepticism goes up and says, well, it says it's Adamic, but it was really written after Christ.
Yeah, well, again, I think that the legacy of because when you look at the primary Adamic literature, certainly some of them would be older and possibly after the coming of Christ, but there's enough, and I think that the legacy worldwide of the story of life of Adam and Eve, that there's prophecies contained in all of them. And I know that at least some of them are older and perhaps, were predating the incarnation of Christ, like the Thracian Chronicles, the Book of Atum and Ua. And Kent, do you want to comment? Then we'll go back to Doug.
Right. Well, thinking about, and like I said, Doug's looking for this linkage looking for some proof or some evidence, again, of how a story that Adam and Eve had, and how did it link through the 5,500 years from Adam and Eve and to Christ. Obviously, we have to. I mean, we've inductively we can assume, because the rabbis changed the 5,500 years to something else, they must have had some sort of motivation. Then when you start looking for this linkage, that's where I start finding in all these other books, like you were describing there, Zen, these Adamic literatures. Now, I basically have only focused on the first and second book of Adam and Eve, and in there I do see a linkage. And I'm curious what Doug's reaction would be, because, like I say, we've spoken off air, and we've never really, we sort of wanted to save our discussion for the audience. So I just wanted to kind of submit my comments on the linkage from Adam and Eve to where did it go from Adam and Eve, right?
Right.
How did it get from Adam and Eve to us to that day? So I have a little scenario here in the second book of Adam and Eve that speaks of, as the days of Seth came to an end, he asked his sons to bring him an offering so that he might bring it before the Lord. And God accepted his offering and sent his blessing upon him and his children. Then he, speaking of God, said to Seth, at the end of the great 5.5 days, which I told your father about, I'll send my word to save you and your descendants. And when Seth died at the age of 912, Enoch was 20 years old. Now, skipping forward to a later passage, and it says, Then Jared, now this is the father of Enoch, right? This is several generations later now. Then Jared made an offering on the altar, just as Adam had commanded him, and God appeared to Jared at the altar and blessed him and his children according to the offering. Then God revealed to him the promise that he had made previously to Adam. He explained to Jared the 5,500 years and revealed the mystery of his coming upon the earth. And Enoch kept the command of Jared his father. It is this Enoch to whom many wonders occurred, and who also wrote a celebrated book, but all these wonders could not be contained in this place. And that little word right there, a book. Now, people can argue, and they're going to argue all day long, all these, and these are Bible-believing people, which is so ironic. The people believe in the power of God, and they believe in the power of his word, but somehow his word and his power cannot transmit a book that then transmitted the knowledge of this 5,500 years. And are they well-meaning, or are they confused, or are they well-meaning and they're just looking for evidence? And is it up to us? Because these prophecies were not just of Enoch's day. As we well know, the prophecies that Enoch handed down were for a future generation, at which time we would be able to maybe put all these pieces together. Well, and maybe we're doing that job now.
Okay. Now, for instance, I believe that one Enoch, which was, I guess you'd say scholars would generally, identify that book having been written in what's called the Second Temple period, which, places it sort of intertestamental. We know that one Enoch, the book of Enoch, was read and understood and appreciated by the church. It was referenced and quoted in the book of Jude, and it's an allusion is made to it in Second Peter. So we know that it has influenced a lot Christian thinking, and Michael Heiser, who's a really great scholar, has talked about a number of passages. Even Paul's discussion of why women are to have coverings on their head because of their angels, because of the angels and so forth. So there's references there that are to one Enoch. Now the question is, where is the 5,500-year prophecy? It's not in one Enoch. It's not in Jasher. It's not in Jubilees. It's in some other literature. But, my question to you, Kent, is, I'm not unbelieving. I obviously believe in prophecy, but I am also a historian. And so I look at whether or not there's historical evidence that the book was written prior to the time of Christ. We can look at those books, for instance, if we look at the book of the Maccabees, First and Second Maccabees in the Apocrypha. What's the evidence that it was written, say, 150 AD versus 50 AD? And there's various kinds of historical tools that you look at to make those kinds of determinations. It is.
What about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls certainly include and talk about a number of the apocryphal books and a number of this kind of literature. And to the extent that we can find in the Dead Sea Scrolls a reference to the Adamic literature and the 5,500-year prophecy, I am all down for that. I would love that. I'm just worried that the references are not that explicit. But having said that, I mean, Kent, the work you did on the pyramid and the sort of the allusions within the pyramid to the 5.5 days and so forth, that's pretty powerful stuff. It's pretty fascinating. I mean, folks that, are doubters are going to speculate that, well, you're just, you are just speculating, but, but it's pretty cool stuff. So, but I'm still just looking for what books were written before Christ that tell us about the 5,500-year prophecy, because I'd like to show the linkage between those books and Irenaeus or Tertullian or any of the others that mention, because the way they mention it for the audience's benefit, the way they mention it around the 2nd or 3rd century after Christ is they say, hey, the Lord was going to come 5,500 years after Adam, and so he's going to come back any time now, because they were looking at the 5,500-year prophecy as being not fulfilled when Jesus was first on earth, but being fulfilled right after, because they thought Jesus was he came around 5,000 years from Adam, and they were thinking, well, by 5,500, the Lord is going to be with us again. We're going to get raptured. So that was their point of view.
Well, yeah, and speaking of that, the unfolding of God's prophecies has always been like the mountain ranges of where you look at from them from afar. One mountain range looks like one mountain range. Then when you get to the foothills, you find out, oh goodness, there's actually 2 and 3 mountain ranges that we're seeing collapse into one. So the idea that the coming of the Lord was inconceivable as being 2 events to the first church age, because they never bothered to mention it, right? Enoch, speaking of the coming of the Son of Man, he never said, oh, there's 2, by the way. And this is what baffled, the disciples and the Jews especially, because they assumed that Jesus was speaking when he spoke of being the Son of Man. They assumed, well, you're talking about the Enochian Son of Man who's going to come and break the teeth of sinners. And they completely skipped the part that in Enoch, if you read between the lines, you'll actually see he also spoke of being tormented by the house of the ones that he came to. So there's actually a weak side, you might call it, a supplicant, and this is the suffering servant of Isaiah. And we really have to accept the fact that God's prophecies has always been an unfolding process, so that we, for example, we in the now are actually learning more about the knowledge of what is the prophetic word that even the ones that uttered it didn't even see, because they were speaking under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So there's just a lot of prophecy that is, we have to accept that, that there's always has to be perspective. History must fulfill prophecy. Prophecy is not something to project. This is why the time setters, the date setters have always failed. The Bible's never given us prophecy to predict dates. It's given to us so that when Jesus fulfills them as a suffering Messiah, then suddenly we recognize, oh, that's why he closed the book of Isaiah in the temple when he said, in this day, the scriptures fulfilled, when he spoke of the suffering Messiah, the favorable day of the Lord, and he stopped and he didn't read the part about the future coming, so that we would then know that there's 2 comings, not 1.
Well, let me raise this point though, because I disagree with you in the sense that, I'm certainly one of the first to say, we're foolish to speculate as to the day and the hour when Christ is going to come, but I certainly do believe that there are examples in prophecy. In Daniel chapter 9 would be the principal one, in which the 70 weeks of years and so forth. We know the work has been done by quite a number of folks that Jesus came, the first coming spoken of in Daniel chapter 9. It was very clear that he came in 30 AD, and it was depending upon which of the decrees to go and rebuild
Correct.
Jerusalem.
3 dates, no less than
right?
3 dates.
Yeah, well, that's
So
right.
there's always
but,
speed bumps. There's always speed bumps. So prophecy is there to anticipate. There are speed bumps.
Did Daniel though give us a fairly precise date?
Absolutely.
He did. And so I'm saying, no, prophecy can do that. And the 5,500 year prophecy would appear that it's doing that. And I believe that it could absolutely be done. All I'm looking for is sort of the prima facie evidence that says, okay, it was this book or these books that were familiar to the apostles, just like they were familiar with 1 Enoch. All right. So we all agree they were familiar with 1 Enoch. We all agree that they were familiar with Jubilees. The book of Jasher is another question. I mean, I have a strong suspicion that the book of Jasher we have today is in fact a forgery, but that's, all of the pseudepigraphy, you have to look at each one of the books on its own merits to see whether it was likely to be true or not. So I'll throw out one other thing. I did have a chance, Zen, from the books that your folks sent me to read Budge's book, The Cave of Treasures. And so there's a number of lines in that book, because that book lays out what was said, and then Wallace Budge, who's really a extremely well known and highly renowned Egyptologist, that he did his work in the 1920s, 1930s. He did a lot of translations, and so he did translations, I think, of the books of Adam and Eve's. Yeah, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is his most famous, right? And so his interest, he did a lot of these translations for the British Museum, and he was fascinated by these apocryphal books. And so he talks about the Cave of Treasures likely being written as early as the 4th century by Ephraim the Syrian, but it could have been written in the 5th or 6th century AD. All right, so he doesn't make the claim that that book was written prior to the time of Christ, or that it was written, 3,000 or 4,000 years before Christ. He just indicates that it is a book like a number of books that fall into this category, that the Christians in Syria at that time, because these books were written in Syriac, many of them, they were hungry to know more. They wanted more information. And so, there was work done to create, in effect, legendary books that did not necessarily follow the scripture. In fact, there's strong evidence, and I think specifically I read about in that book, where the book of the Cave of Treasures does not buy into the book of 1 Enoch, because it believes that the sons of God are in fact the Seth.
Yeah.
Right. It does give credence to the book of Adam and Eve. You remember I read that last time.
Sure, it does. Sure, it does. But
okay.
But my question to you is, so what? In other words, book? Are you saying Adam and Eve? The book was written by Adam and Eve?
We don't. The Bible says, or the Bible, I should say, the Bible says that God walked and talked with Enoch, and Enoch had a conversation, and that he was given a book to write. So I would stick with what I'm reading about, and saying that Enoch wrote the book. Enoch wrote these books.
I would disagree. I think that's it's called pseudepigrapha for a reason.
Well, again, he had a wonderful conversation, and then it had no purpose for our future, so it got lost. This is the whole argument. Is God has the ability to speak. We have the ability to hear. We have the ability to see. We have the ability to read. And the fact that God couldn't preserve those works. This is why I go back to the pyramid.
We don't know that those books were written. The pyramid.
As I said, the pyramid is Enoch's
pillar. The pyramid is not canonical scripture. This is where I go back to saying, okay, what does the scripture teach us? And I want to believe. I'm kind of like Mulder in the X-Files.
Right.
I want to believe. I'm just wanting, because we can look at historical tools and we can say, okay, we know 1 Enoch was written before Christ. It was written 200 to 300 years before Christ. We believe that the book of Daniel may have had elements that were written by Daniel, but it may also have been written as late as 300 or even 200 BC. All right, so it depends upon the historical analysis that's done. What I'm saying is that I'm not familiar with any academic work that lays out that the book of Adam and Eve or the Adamic literature does in fact show evidence that it existed before the time of Christ. Now, I think, Zen, you talk about the Thracian information that, perhaps there it does. Perhaps that material does exist that shows evidence that it did exist long before the time of Christ.
Yeah, I think, don't quote me on this, but I do believe that the Thracian material and the historical legacy of that they were a culture that predated the Sumerians by 1,500 years. And they were, again, Christians and had knowledge of the coming of Christ. And I believe that they have what we now source perhaps as the origin for much of the primary Adamic literature, because there's chapters that are extant in that particular their rendition of the life of Adam and Eve that are not found in any of the others. But also, I think when it comes to even pseudepigraphal texts, that even though we have individuals that are cited as later having written them, that perhaps maybe they didn't write them, but received and maybe transliterated or transcribed what was a very ancient text. And I'll give you an example of this from a text called the Abaddon, the Angel of Death, and it actually says this about the author of this particular discourse. It says, the author of the discourse is Timothy, the patriarch of Alexandria, who died in 385, who transcribes a legend which he found in an ancient volume in the library, which was founded by the holy apostles and supplied with histories of their lives and acts for the edification of believers. In this particular text, it says this as far as the 5,500-year prophecy. And it goes into great elaboration, but I'm only going to read this specific part. Thy soul shall abide in Amente, and thou shalt sit in black darkness this is Christ speaking to Adam, I believe. Thy soul shall abide in Amente, and thou shalt sit in black darkness for 4,500 of years. And when 5,500 of years are fulfilled, I will send... it's God speaking to him. I will send my beloved Son into the world, and he shall abide in a virgin womb, that is to say, the Holy Virgin Mary. She shall give him birth on the earth in lowliness and humility, and after she hath done so, she shall remain a virgin, even as she was before. He shall pass 33 years and 33.5 years in the world, and he shall receive every attribute of humanity, sin alone excepted. And so, as far as the who originally authored the primary Adamic literature, I do believe that there's a legacy that takes it back to Adam and Eve, and that it was passed down even through Enoch, and perhaps even carried on the ark. Because with the Thracian material, I do believe that stuff was dug up, from this this antediluvian age, and that they were preserved in manner that they then the knowledge was restored to the Thracian people, and then they received the legacy of this information. And there's another text, and I got two more points that I want to make really quick. But in the revelation of the Magi, which is a book that just came out, speaking about how the Magi were the sons of Seth, and how because they had received this prophecy, and I don't know if it makes mention specifically of the 5,500 years, but it does make mention that Adam was told that Christ would incarnate at a specific time and a specific age, and so they began to set up a watch. and did so over this period of time. And in one of the prophecies, they were told that when Christ came and incarnated into flesh, that he would lead them to the cave of treasures where they would receive and then gain access to all of the testimonies that were gathered there and that were preserved, and that gave them insight into even the prophecies of his coming. And it also spoke of a prophecy that they would find there the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh that was given to Adam when he was exiled from paradise.
In the cave of
Yeah,
treasures. Yep.
in the cave of treasures. And then they would bring that to Christ as a fulfillment of a prophecy that is also found in
And
the
that's in the book of
primary
Adam and
comic
Eve.
literature.
And
Yeah,
that's
so
described in the book of Adam and Eve. So,
yeah,
yes.
so those are things that are very interesting. But all right, when we come back, I'll describe one other thing. We'll be right back, everyone.
Real people, real radio.
Initiating the truth frequency.
This is Truth Frequency Radio. All right, welcome back, everybody, for final segment. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Secrets Revealed here on Truth Frequency Radio, and I have as guests with me both W. Kent Smith and S. Douglas Woodward, and we are talking about the 5,500-year prophecy given to Adam and Eve when exiled from paradise by the word of the Lord, Christ as the logos of his incarnation into flesh form, and how dying on the cross he would redeem them and restore them to their former estate. One final point that I wanted to make here, and this has to do with the first book of Enoch, which I do believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that they are older and predate the coming of Christ into flesh form, and that they are prophetic in speaking about him as the elect one, and God as the Ancient of Days, and him as the Son of Man, as spoken of in the book of Daniel as well. But what is interesting, and this is something that we might consider, that in the book of Enoch, after the book on the courses of the heavenly luminaries, beginning in chapter 84, Enoch describes a dream vision that he had of all the generations of humanity being born in almost like an Animal Farm tale, where he uses metaphorically the description of the cows and the bulls, and that as being the patriarchs, and then Cain's line being the black cows, and describes even the stars, and then the children that came up from the children of Cain, that the elephants, horses, and asses, and just all these weird Animal Farm kind of parallels that describe the generations of humanity, beginning with Adam and Eve, and going all down through the line, and even the coming of Christ. And what I was wondering is if somebody was knowledgeable on all of the lifetimes and the years of the lives of the different patriarchs that are described in this particular dream vision,
if adding up those years, if it would come out to be 5,500 years, because that would be interesting, and that would be something that might be, what you might be looking for, Doug, in trying to get a confirmation from an ancient source as to this particular prophecy, and in this case, not spoken of directly, but encoded into the text in a manner that we could figure out and confirm the premise of what we're speaking about.
Well, I certainly think that the the Jewish leaders leading up to the time of Christ, so we'll say, in the Second Temple period, 1 to 2 centuries before, they certainly had probably familiarity, I would think, with the Book of Enoch. Was probably very popular then, and we know that at that time they believed in the chronology in the Septuagint. The Septuagint chronology told them that, just as Josephus talks about in the 1st century, he talks about 5,000 years. He's really rounding at that point, because other places he specifically talks about 5,500 years. But we know that, and in other words, I would think that the Book of Enoch, if it goes down that path, I know it talks about 70 generations relatively early on, and it says that it speaks to those in the generation, kind of in the last generation, right before Christ is to return, right? And so, so it's very definitely prophetic, just as the Book of Daniel is also apocalyptic and very prophetic. So I think it would probably speak to that. So there's no question that we know about the 5,500 years because of the Septuagint's chronology, and we know the piece we know, as I said, is that the church fathers reference the fact that it was in effect a common belief that that's when the Messiah was going to come. And so the piece we don't know yet is what specifically was very likely influencing the rabbis to cause them to change the chronology from basically 5,500 years from Adam to their time to 4,000 years. And we know that, by the way, it was broken up into 2 pieces. 1,386 years were taken out of Genesis 5 and 11, and the number varies. It's between 165 to 195 years were taken out of, in effect, the Jewish calendar, officially finalized, say in 160 A.D., the Seder Olam Rabbah by Yosei ben Haftalah, I believe it was, and there they take out 165 to 195 years out of the Persian kings after the time of the Babylonian captivity. And so those two things added together exceed almost 1,600 years. I think it's like 1587 or something like that. But it's a bunch of years, and that's how you really get from the I estimate that the timing is closer to 5,600 years, but it's, we'll say 5,500 years from that time. And instead they come up with 4,000 years. And, but they do it in those 2 pieces, the Book of Daniel, changing the actual calendar of the Persian kings by cutting out several of the kings, and then taking out 1,386 years out of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11.
Yeah, one thing really quickly, in the Gospel of Nicodemus, we see that when they count out that particular prophecy, Pilate confronts them and asks them if they knew that Yeshua was the Son of God in the fulfillment of the prophecies. They kick everybody out of the temple, close all the doors, and then break down this 5,500-year prophecy and show that indeed he was the long-awaited Savior Messiah. And then they implore Pilate not to let anybody know, because they feel like they're going to get stoned by their people for having killed the Messiah. And so I think that is, shows plainly as to what they were up to, and how even then they implored him to hide this knowledge and to keep it from, being made public.
Right.
And I think that is also the incentive for what they are trying to do and trying to deny and also hide that he was the fulfillment of those prophecies. Kent,
And
we'll go to you,
yes,
and then we'll go
thank you.
back to Doug. Yeah.
You were reading my mind, because I'm back to the numbers again, right, Doug? That very verse, that very scenario, one of the reasons that they believed in the 5,500 year timeline in the first place, because ironically, if you add up the numbers, they're a little bit fudged. They're not quite exactly 5,500 years, but they're the controlling factor in the logic and they finally confessed to killing Christ. Was they said, and we looked in the 70 books, and we saw that God spoke to Moses about building the Ark of the Covenant in dimensions of how many?
Yes.
5.5.
Right.
And not 5.6, and not 4.9, and not 4.0. They said based on doesn't even enter into the how long is a cubit? Is a cubit 25 inches? Who was it that wrote? Isaac Newton wrote on the sacred cubit. Was it 25 inches? Is it 18 inches? Well, you know what? It doesn't really matter, because it does say 5, and it does say, it adds up to 5.5. It's 1.5 this and 1.5 that, and then 2 of that. You add it up, it's 5.5 cubits. So based on this idea of the Ark of the Covenant being built in the dimensions of 5.5 cubits, we therefore assume, based on that the Christ would come in the ark of a body after 5.5 days. And so we added it all up, and even they then realized that the 5.5 was the controlling factor, and not 4 and not 5.6 to argue about the preciseness of who said what and how many years, but the 5.5 is our controlling factor, and that alone would tell you why 100 years later they were trying to change the chronology from 5,500 years.
Right. I think the comment I would make is that it seems very likely, almost a given, that there was an oral tradition that the Messiah was going to come 5.5 millennia from Adam to, he would come and become the Messiah on earth. I think there was probably a strong oral tradition. Unfortunately, I think that the stories like the Gospel of Nicodemus and all that, I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know that didn't occur, but you're going to have a hard time with any scholar saying, that absolutely did occur. It probably is an oral tradition that was set down as a story, a very good story, and it does hearken to the 5.5 year, I'll call it oral tradition, and so that's cool. That's cool, but I don't think you want people to actually believe that Annas and Caiaphas actually had a conversation with Pilate and they actually had this discussion, because there's zero evidence for that. The story is written down, but that certainly doesn't mean it really happened. I don't believe a lot of things that are written down, especially Democratic propaganda from the Democratic Party.
Well, again, what are the odds then of these separate books? What are the odds of what is the second book of Adam and Eve? Excuse me, the second book of Enoch, the Secrets of Enoch. It describes Adam and Eve being in paradise for 5.5 days, which corresponds to the fact that Israel was in the land for 70 weeks of years, and that's why God exiled them from the land, because it says very specifically that God had them out of the land to let the land lie fallow, according to the year of the Jubilees, that they were supposed to let the land lie fallow. So there's a specific correspondence in God's word to being under God's grace and then being out of God's grace. So I thought it's kind of an interesting coincidence that second Enoch. Now I say it's a heck of a coincidence and a heck of it'd be a hell of a forgery.
Isn't it? Well, isn't second Enoch written after the time of Christ?
Well, as I said, and again, was second Ezra not written after Moses's books? But yet he somehow.
No, you have to be really. You're getting confused between Ezra. In Hebrew, Ezra is it's called Ezra, and then in the Septuagint, it's called 1 Esdras and 2 Esdras, which really corresponds roughly with Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible. But
it was 500 years before Christ, and it was after Moses, right? Was it not?
Yeah, but
Sure.
but you jump over and talk about second Esdras, which is actually fourth Esdras, which is actually is a pseudepigraphal work that wasn't written by Ezra. Very likely wasn't written. Well, I'm just saying that
But my point was that God in there it records that the books that were lost in the Babylonian captivity were essentially orally transcribed to Ezra, so that he revived all that was written and all that was lost because of the fire, according to the scripture in the second Ezra. So I'm just looking at a parallel event.
All of that. But what you're doing is you're mixing up the canonical Ezra with a pseudepigraphal Esdras about the 70 books and the 24 books and all that.
Well, the same could be said about John the Revelator and the idea that John was not the John the disciple. So does it matter that John the disciple wrote the Gospel of John but not the book of Revelation? Or do they both stand on their own two legs?
Who wrote fourth Esdras? We don't know. It all follows from the same literature. All the literature it adheres together, from what I understand. And I'm open-minded. I would love to have kind of a nice, strong historical case presented that says, okay, this book was written 100 years before Christ, and therefore we can really take a look at that, and we can understand that there is a prophecy here that was fulfilled. But my view is that most of this literature was written after the time of Christ, and the writers of it wrote it in such a way that they wanted people to believe that the prophecies were very literally given before the events occurred, but that they are legendary. That's my sense, and I think that there are distinctions. I think 1 Enoch is a distinction. I think it had a very strong case to be included in the New Testament. I believe it was Tertullian, but I could be wrong, that argued vehemently that 1 Enoch should be in the New Testament, but it was not. Ultimately, he finally said, okay, the church has voted. The church does not believe it should be. Okay, I'll give up. I won't fight it anymore.
All right. I mentioned that in the opening chapters of Tales of Forever, so I'll try to scan for that, because I think it was Augustine and Jerome that didn't like the angelology of First Enoch, and because they were confusing it with the idea that Jesus was just the highest angel of the hierarchy.
Well,
of angels.
Augustine was if I'm not mistaken, was the originator of the Sethite view, and so they did not buy into the idea that the sons of God.
Yeah, it was Africanus. Africanus was the one who first mentioned the idea that the sons of God were the Sethianites. So that
I stand corrected. My understanding was it was Augustine, but either way,
he picked it up.
Either way, it was by the time you get to the 4th and 5th century, the concept of the sons of God being in effect angels that intermarried with humans and creating the Nephilim as giants. That idea was pretty much scrubbed by then. It's only been in the last 150 years that we've reopened that question about were the sons of God in fact angels, and were the men of renown, the Nephilim, were they in fact hybrids?
All right. So reading from the Centuries of Suppression in the opening chapters of Tales of Forever, it says that that while the book of Revelation and the first book of Enoch were sort of side by side for the first 4 centuries of the Christian era, it says while many of the church fathers such as Clement, Ambrose, and Tertullian endorsed the first Enoch, others did not hold to this favorable view, and because of their efforts, this influential book, or the influential opponents of the book, like Augustine and Jerome, who were critical of Enoch's description of those peculiar angels, or watchers as they were called, the book was eventually deemed heretical.
And of course,
Clement, Ambrose, and Tertullian liked it, and Augustine and Jerome said,
we would say it's not heretical. We would say it deserves consideration.
Yeah, well, these guys, as you well know, Athanasius is sort of the first guy in his festive letters, where he was the progenitor of the canon, and he literally condemned these, anything beyond these other books that, like the Gospels and that's the Jewish books, and he used the word heretical. He said, man, he condemned anybody that doesn't read just these so many books in the canon they are heretics. He used the word heretical,
Well,
and that's from which we get heresiology.
Yeah, but but that, the decision about the canon, it was basically Athanasius put the icing on the cake, but the cake had already been baked. The church had, if you go through, in fact, I talk about it in the article. I lay out step by step which church patriot, but basically said there were 22 books, then it grew to 27, and so on, and then eventually there was several councils that confirmed the canon. And Athanasius was his festal letter, Easter letter of 367 AD, was one of the pillars that is looked at to sort of say, okay, the canon has been settled. And some of them may have said heretical books, but I'm saying, that they of course allowed for the Apocrypha, but they identified certain pseudepigrapha as heretical. And they may have said that, First Enoch was heretical. That doesn't mean that they necessarily were right. And I would say the same for the Adamic literature. It may be very legitimate, and there may be strong evidence that material existed in the Second Temple period. I would love to see that written up. I'd love to see that. My sense is that I think it's like a good dream that it was, but I don't know that it was. But I do think it seems like the evidence, circumstantial evidence, seems to say there was clearly an oral tradition that the Messiah was going to come 5,500 years from Adam, and it could well have been given rise by the Ark of the Covenant, the dimensions you talk about. I think that the pyramid, I'm not sure how much the Jewish rabbis knew about the dimensions of the pyramid. I would suspect.
No, that's for our day. No,
yeah,
that's
I
for our
suspect
day.
that they didn't know that, but I think that the Ark
The
of
scientific
the Covenant,
age was required to penetrate the dimensional meaning of the pyramid.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, that's one of the strong selling points of your book is the not only recapping kind of all of these different threads that we've talked about of evidence, but also going into detail the pyramidology and the story of the pyramid and how it too appears to put forth this idea of a 5.5 millennial period of time. So.
Right. And of course, none of the pyramidologists ever even had a clue to look for the 5.5. They just extensively verified that the number 5 is the most central number in the pyramid. 5 this, 5 that's the number of grace, and the number of grace is here and it's there and it's everywhere. And it blew my mind because I've known about the pyramidology for many, many years, but I had no idea that the extent to which it was sitting there waiting for someone to weave it into the storyline of the 5.5 day prophecy.
Well, which is what you did.
Right.
Yeah, that plus the Spear of Destiny.
Yes, which was another bombshell that blew my mind too. I had done extensive work on the spear, and then found out that it was one of my cats. I have an invader in my room here.
You have a cat?
One of my cats. I was trying to cool my room off. So anyway, the extent to which the symbolism of tying together not just the pyramid, and this was my effort, as you well know, Doug. I understand the impossibility of going back and discerning to determine when were these books written. So I had to come up with, physical evidence and ways that we can figure out where the smoking gun lies to bring that metaphor back. So the idea of the pyramidology, the stones, Jesus said, if men don't praise me, the stones will cry out. Well, they've conjectured that the stones that are crying out are the stones of the pyramid, and the fact that it's Enoch's pillar. And that Enoch, I was looking for evidence that Enoch's 5.5 days, like you say, wasn't just in a book. This guy didn't just write a book. He wrote an architectural masterpiece that enshrined the 5 and the 5.5 days, and it was lying there waiting. And now, when you read Tales of Forever, you're going to read exactly how the 5.5 days is revealed there, and to provide a modern proof of this 5.5 days, as well as then the connection between the Spear of Destiny that allegedly pierced the side of Jesus and the Shroud of Turin, because everybody's looking at how do you verify the Shroud of Turin? How do you verify the legends of the spear? But the idea that it could actually all connect to 5.5, it's all there in a mathematical way to express it, and not in a arcane, hidden, impossible, you got to be a genius to figure it out. all these mathematical codes, which the pyramid sometimes does force you to try to do, and your mind is numbed out when you try to study the 4 volumes of Rutherford. But if you could just boil it down to the 5.5 days, and you can connect the Ark of the Covenant, the Spear of Destiny, the symbolism that's in the shroud, it's an amazing way, and the idea that it all ties together with this prophecy of 5.5 days.
Well, and importantly, the Septuagint chronology,
and that too,
which to me is kind of the foundational point. Is once you understand that the Septuagint provides a very specific chronology of Adam to Christ of 5,500 years, then all of a sudden everything else becomes, kind of the epilogue to that whole story,
One last thing, because we're down to the end of the show. But I think what is really interesting about this whole premise is that, God said that he would pour out his spirit on all flesh at the end of days. And that Enoch wrote his book for a remote and distant generation. And being in that fig tree generation, which I do believe we're the last generation, I think these kind of things are coming out for consideration. And that this is why we are even discussing these things. And so that to me is the most interesting aspect of this particular prophecy. We've got 3 minutes remaining. I want to give each of you just a minute to, comment in closing. Doug?
Yeah, okay. I think that the literature that we've talked about that is pseudepigraphal, that I think comes after the time of Christ, I think it reinforces that very early on in the early church that there was an awareness, and it also reinforces, if nothing else, it reinforces that the early church knew that the chronology was 5,500 years, not 4,000 years. And just as Justin Martyr said, and others said, Irenaeus and so forth, the Jews changed the scriptures. And so the chronology was 5,500 years from Adam to Christ. And so now whether or not it was purely an oral tradition or whether there was literature written, to some extent, it doesn't matter. Although I just think it would be additional confirmation if it did. So I think it's legitimate. I think it's kind of a breakthrough point, and I'm enthusiastic about it.
Me too. Kip?
Yeah, well, again, I think, we're on the verge of literally what we were talking about in the first opening paragraph of your quote there, Zen, a paradigm shift. For 15 centuries, the 5,500 years was common knowledge. We completely lost that due to the backlash of the Reformation, right, where everything Septuagint was basically erased it. Now here we are 500 years later. Literally on the anniversary, we're back to it being brought back into form. It's our job to get it. It's the paradigm shift.
All right, guys. I appreciate you. God bless everyone. Good night. Shalom.